Two Beverly Hills officers thought they could bully a Hollywood legend's wife right on Rodeo Drive. They didn't realize who they were truly dealing with. What happened next was definitely not in their training manual. The California night draped itself over Beverly Hills like a velvet curtain, studded with the diamonds of distant city lights. A gentle breeze, carrying the scent of night-blooming jasmine and expensive perfume, drifted down Rodeo Drive. Here, under the warm glow of elegant street lamps, the world felt curated, a perfect fantasy of wealth and serenity. The hushed murmur of conversation from sidewalk cafes and the whisper-quiet purr of luxury cars were the only sounds that punctuated the peace. Stepping out from the gilded doors of a Michelin-starred restaurant was Jason Statham, a man whose presence was as sharp and defined as a tailored suit. At 55, he moved with the coiled energy of a predator, an economy of motion that spoke of discipline and power held in reserve. Beside him, his wife, Elena Vance, was the embodiment of grace. A former supermodel turned acclaimed fashion designer, she wore one of her own creations, a sleek, champagne-colored silk slip dress that flowed over her form like liquid moonlight. Her arm was linked through his, her head resting lightly on his shoulder as they walked. "That was divine," Elena murmured, her voice a soft melody against the city's hum. The chef outdid himself. Jason's lips curved into a rare, genuine smile. "Only the best for you, love." His tone was a low rumble, a stark contrast to his on-screen growl, filled with a warmth reserved only for her. They approached their vehicle, a deep gray Aston Martin DB11, its polished surface reflecting the boutique lights like a dark mirror. The moment was perfect, a snapshot of quiet joy in a life lived in the public eye. But perfection is fragile. Leaning against a black and white patrol car parked directly behind the Aston Martin were two figures, their uniforms a stark intrusion into the opulent scene. Officer Kowalski, a man built like a bulldog with a thick neck and a permanent scowl, crossed his arms over his chest. His gaze was heavy, dismissive. His partner, Officer Dawson, was younger, wiry, with eyes that darted around, soaking in the wealth with a bitter envy. He chewed his gum with a slow, rhythmic insolence. Kowalski muttered something to Dawson, his voice a low growl. "Look at this. Another Hollywood clown playing king for a night." Dawson snickered, his eyes fixated on Elena. "And look at her. That dress probably costs more than my car." The laugh they shared was small and sharp, a shard of glass in the tranquil air. Jason's stride didn't falter, but a subtle tension tightened the muscles in his jaw. Years of training had taught him to mask his reactions, but his senses were on high alert. He felt Elena stiffen beside him. She had heard them too. Her smile vanished. "Just ignore them, Jason," she whispered, a plea in her voice. "Let's just go." But the officers had other plans. As Jason reached for the Aston Martin's sleek door handle, Kowalski pushed himself off the patrol car, his movements deliberately slow and confrontational. "Nice car," he said, his voice laced with mock admiration. He began to circle the vehicle, his boots scuffing the pristine pavement. "A little too nice for this neighborhood, don't you think? Draws the wrong kind of attention." Jason turned his head, his expression unreadable, his eyes like chips of ice. "Is there a problem, officer?" Dawson stepped forward, his tone oily with false sincerity. "Actually, we've had reports of a vehicle matching this description involved in some financial irregularities. Just doing our due diligence." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, Mr. Statham?" Elena's grip on Jason's arm tightened. "This is ridiculous. The car is registered to him." "Oh, we'll check," Kowalski said, his focus shifting entirely to Elena. He let his gaze travel down the length of her silk dress, lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. "That's quite an outfit," he purred, taking a step closer. He reached out a hand, his thick fingers extended. "Mind if I?" Before anyone could react, his fingertips brushed against the delicate silk of her dress, a deliberate, invasive touch that violated the space between them. The moment Kowalski's fingers made contact with the silk, the air crackled. Elena flinched back as if burned, her eyes flashing with a mixture of shock and disgust. "Excuse me," she snapped, her voice sharp and clear. "Don't touch me." Before the officer's smug grin could fully form, Jason moved. It wasn't a large movement, but it was impossibly fast. His hand shot out, clamping around Kowalski's wrist like a vice. The speed was startling, a blur of motion that the officer never saw coming. The casual arrogance on Kowalski's face dissolved, replaced by a flash of pained surprise. I said, Jason's voice was dangerously low, each word a block of granite. "Don't touch her." Kowalski instinctively tried to yank his hand back, but Jason's grip was immovable. For a tense second, the two men were locked in a silent battle of wills. Finally, Jason released him. Kowalski stumbled back a step, shaking his wrist, his face flushing a deep, angry red. The mask of authority had slipped, revealing the raw ego beneath. "You're assaulting an officer," he snarled, his voice rising. "I stopped you from making a bigger mistake," Jason replied coldly, his body now a subtle shield between his wife and the two men. Dawson, seeing his partner challenged, stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "Whoa, tough guy, huh?" He jeered, his hand drifting casually toward his belt. "What are you gonna do? This isn't one of your movies, mate. Out here, we're the ones with the power. Power that you're abusing," Jason countered, his gaze unwavering. Elena tugged at his sleeve, her voice urgent and laced with fear. "Jason, please. It's not worth it. Let's just get in the car and leave." She knew this was a fire that could quickly rage out of control. These were men with badges and fragile pride, a volatile combination. But Kowalski was too far gone, humiliated and furious. He saw only a challenge that had to be met. He lunged forward again, not at Jason, but at Elena. With a vicious, deliberate movement, he grabbed a handful of her champagne-colored silk dress. His fist clenched, twisting the delicate fabric. And then he pulled. Rip. The sound was sickeningly loud in the quiet street. It wasn't a tear, it was a violent shredding. The fine silk, designed to flow with grace, split from her thigh to her hip, an ugly, jagged gash that shattered the gown's elegance. The sound seemed to hang in the air, an echo of the violation. Elena gasped a sharp, wounded sound. She stumbled back, her hands flying to cover the ruined dress, to cover her exposed skin. Her face went pale, and her eyes, wide with shock, instantly filled with tears of humiliation. The perfect evening, the beautiful dress, her sense of safety, all torn apart in a single, brutal second. Kowalski let the scrap of fabric fall from his fingers. He laughed. It was a harsh, ugly sound, devoid of humor and full of malice. "Oops," he sneered, his eyes glinting with cruel satisfaction. "Guess it wasn't made very well." Jason didn't move. His expression remained a mask of stone, but something inside him shifted. The controlled calm that was his trademark transformed into an unnerving stillness, the absolute tranquility at the eye of a hurricane. His shoulders squared, his jaw clenched, and every muscle in his body seemed to coil, tightening into springs of pure, focused rage. He was no longer just a man. He was a weapon waiting. Elena saw the change in him, and a different kind of fear gripped her. "Jason, no," she whispered, her voice trembling. But he didn't seem to hear her. His eyes, cold and dark, were locked on Kowalski. There was no anger in them now, only a terrifyingly calm certainty. It was the look of a man who had already calculated every outcome and chosen his path. "You just made," Jason said, his voice barely a whisper but carrying the weight of a death sentence, "a very serious error in judgment." Dawson scoffed, trying to regain the upper hand. "What, you gonna hit a cop over a piece of cloth?" His hand moved decisively towards his baton, his knuckles white. And just like that, the stillness broke. As Dawson's fingers wrapped around the handle of his baton, Jason exploded into motion. It was not the choreographed flair of a movie fight. It was the brutal efficiency of real-world combat. In the space of a single heartbeat, he closed the distance. His left hand shot out, not in a punch, but as an open palm strike that slapped Dawson's hand away from his weapon with a sharp crack. Before Dawson could even register the pain, Jason's right hand seized his wrist, twisting it in a sharp, practiced lock that sent a jolt of agony up his arm. Dawson cried out and dropped to one knee, his body contorting in pain. Kowalski, seeing his partner go down, charged forward with a roar, lowering his shoulder like a bull. It was a clumsy, rage-fueled attack. Jason pivoted on the ball of his foot, a seamless, fluid movement. Kowalski's charge met only empty air. As the larger man stumbled past, off balance, Jason's legs swept out in a low, powerful arc. It connected with Kowalski's ankle with absolute precision. There was no dramatic flip. Kowalski simply crashed to the pavement, the air driven from his lungs with a heavy whoosh. He landed hard on his back, his head hitting the concrete with a dull thud. His firearm, jarred loose from its holster by the impact, skittered across the asphalt, spinning into the darkness under the patrol car. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds. Silence descended once more, thick and absolute. The two officers were sprawled on the ground, one groaning in pain, the other dazed and breathless. Jason stood over them, his chest rising and falling in slow, controlled breaths. He hadn't thrown a single punch. He hadn't raised his voice. But the message was delivered with devastating clarity. Elena watched, her hands pressed to her mouth, a storm of horror, fear, and a strange, fierce pride swirling within her. Jason looked down at the two men, his shadow falling over them. He took one step closer, a deliberate, final movement. "Now," he said, his voice a low, rumbling thunder that seemed to shake the very ground they lay on. "You will apologize to my wife." Kowalski stared up at him, the rage in his eyes now mixed with a dawning, primal fear. He was looking at a man who had just dismantled him and his partner without effort, and who looked like he hadn't even begun to try. He had mistaken control for weakness. He now understood he was facing a level of danger he couldn't comprehend. The 5 seconds of regret had begun, and they felt like an eternity. The streetlights of Rodeo Drive seemed to hum with a new, raw tension. Kowalski coughed, propping himself up on one elbow, his face a mask of disbelief and searing pain. His pride was a shattered wreck. Dawson was still on one knee, clutching his wrist, his face pale and beaded with sweat. They were broken, not just physically, but in their authority, which they had wielded like a club and had just seen splintered against a wall of stone. Jason didn't move. He stood there, a silent, imposing sentinel, waiting. He didn't need to repeat the command. The weight of his presence was enough. Aries, her hands still clutching the torn silk of her dress, found her voice. It was steady, cutting through the thick silence. "Is this what it means to protect and serve?" she asked, her gaze fixed on Kowalski. The officer couldn't meet her eyes. He looked away, shame warring with his fury. The bravado was gone, replaced by the bitter taste of defeat. He finally mumbled, his voice low and gravelly, stripped of its earlier arrogance. "I'm sorry." Dawson, seeing no other way out, quickly echoed the sentiment. "Didn't mean for it to get out of hand." Jason's eyes narrowed. "You meant exactly what you did." He corrected them, his voice cold and precise. "You just didn't expect the consequences." He let the words hang in the air for a moment longer, then turned his back on them. It was the ultimate dismissal. He walked to Elena, his entire demeanor softening as he approached her. With a slow, deliberate motion, he shrugged off his custom-tailored Tom Ford jacket. The expensive fabric whispered as he gently draped it over her shoulders, covering the gash in her dress, enveloping her in its warmth and the faint scent of his cologne. It was an act of profound tenderness and protection. Her eyes met his, and in them, he saw not a victim, but a survivor. Kowalski used the moment to scramble to his feet, his body aching. He limped toward the patrol car, trying to salvage a shred of his authority. He snatched the radio from its cradle. "Dispatch, I need a supervisor at my location," he said, his voice loud and shaky, a desperate attempt to regain control. Jason's voice cut through the night, sharp as a razor. "You'll do nothing of the sort." Kowalski froze, his hand hovering over the radio. "I'm letting this go because my wife is a better person than you will ever be," Jason continued, his voice level, but carrying an unmistakable threat. But if you make that call, if you try to write a report that paints you as the victims, I promise you, this will not end here. It will end on the front page of every paper in this city. Dawson looked at Kowalski, his eyes wide with panic. He knew Jason was right. The body cam footage would be a career-ending disaster. They had instigated, they had assaulted, and they had been neutralized. There was no version of this story where they came out looking like anything but thugs in uniform. Kowalski slowly placed the radio back in its cradle. The two officers, defeated and humiliated, climbed stiffly into their patrol car. They didn't speak. They didn't even look at each other. They just sat there, watching as Jason carefully helped Elena into the passenger seat of the Aston Martin, closing the door with a soft, definitive click. Before getting in, Jason turned and gave the patrol car one last, long look. His stare bored through the windshield, locking onto Kowalski's eyes. He said nothing, but his message was clear: stay away. The Aston Martin's engine purred to life, a low growl that echoed the man behind the wheel. As it pulled smoothly away from the curb, the two officers remained parked, shrouded in a stunned, aching silence. But the night wasn't over. As Jason drove through the winding roads of the Hollywood Hills, he glanced at the rearview mirror. Headlights, the same black and white. They were following, keeping a careful distance, not close enough to be a legal tale, but present enough to be a promise. They're trying to intimidate us, Elena said, her voice tight with anger. Let them, Jason said, his hands steady on the wheel. They're just reminding me of who they are. He didn't take the direct route home. He made a series of calculated turns, testing them. The patrol car mirrored every move. Finally, as they neared their private, gated community, the police car abruptly turned off and vanished. But the sense of being watched lingered. Later that night, as Elena slept, Jason's phone buzzed on the nightstand. An unknown number. He answered. You think you're clever, a distorted voice hissed. It was Kowalski. You embarrassed us. That doesn't just go away. Watch your back, movie star. The line went dead. Jason stared at the phone, his face grim. This wasn't an ending. It was an escalation. The first light of dawn painted the Los Angeles skyline in soft pastels of rose and gold, but the beauty of the morning brought no peace to the Statham residence. Jason sat in a leather armchair in his living room, a cup of untouched coffee on the table beside him. He hadn't slept. The threatening call from Kowalski had replayed in his mind throughout the night, not as a source of fear, but as a tactical problem to be solved. He was a man accustomed to threats, but a threat against his family, in his own home, was a line that could not be uncrossed. Elena came downstairs, wrapped in a silk robe, her face composed, but her eyes carrying the shadows of the previous night. She walked over to him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. She didn't need to ask if he was okay. She knew him better than that. What are you going to do? She asked softly. Whatever is necessary, he replied, his voice quiet but absolute. Just then, a chime echoed through the house, the intercom for the front gate. Jason's body tensed instantly. He moved to the wall-mounted monitor, his movements swift and silent. On the screen, a lone figure stood outside the imposing gates. It was Kowalski. He wasn't in his uniform or his patrol car. He was dressed in civilian clothes, jeans and a plain gray t-shirt, and he stood with his hands in his pockets, his posture radiating not aggression, but a heavy, weary defeat. Elena came to stand beside Jason, her eyes fixed on the screen. What does he want? She whispered. Jason studied the man on the monitor for a long moment, analyzing his body language, the slump of his shoulders, the downcast gaze. This wasn't the same man from last night. He pressed the button to open the gates. Let's find out. Kowalski walked slowly up the long, stone-paved driveway, his steps heavy. The manicured perfection of the estate seemed to mock his disheveled state. Jason opened the front door before the officer could knock, standing in the doorway, an immovable object. Up close, Kowalski looked worse. There was a dark bruise forming on his cheek where his head had hit the pavement, and his eyes were bloodshot. But the most significant change was the absence of arrogance. It had been replaced by something raw and unsettling, shame. He stood on the doorstep for a full minute, the silence stretching between them. Finally, he took a deep, shuddering breath. "I didn't come here to cause more trouble," he said, his voice hoarse. "No radio, no backup. I'm not here as a cop." Jason remained silent, his expression unyielding. His stillness compelled the other man to continue. "I went back to the station last night," Kowalski said, his gaze fixed on the ground. Internal Affairs had already flagged the body cam footage. "My captain called me into his office at 3 a.m. He made me watch it." He paused, swallowing hard. "When you're in it, you tell yourself a story. You're in control, you're enforcing the law. But watching that video, it wasn't me. It was some monster wearing my face." He finally looked up, his eyes meeting Jason's. "I saw your wife's face when the dress ripped. The look in her eyes. I have a daughter, and I thought, what if someone did that to her?" The confession hung in the air, raw and unexpected. Elena stepped forward, her arms crossed, her gaze piercing. "You called here last night. You threatened him." Kowalski flinched as if struck. The shame on his face deepened. "I know. I was trying to feel powerful again after you took it all away. It was pathetic. It was the last act of a coward." He turned his attention fully to her. "Ma'am, Elena, an apology isn't enough. I know that. What I did was inexcusable. I let my own bitterness and ego turn me into a bully. I came here today not because my captain told me to, but because I couldn't live with the man I saw on that screen. I needed to look you both in the eye and tell you that I was wrong. Completely and utterly wrong." The sincerity was undeniable. It wasn't a forced apology under duress. It was the painful reckoning of a man who had been forced to confront the worst version of himself. Jason studied him, his internal calculus shifting. He had been prepared for another confrontation, for violence, for a war. He was not prepared for this. Finally, he gave a single, slow nod. "Then be better," he said, his voice firm but no longer edged with ice. "Next time you see a person, see them, not the car they drive or the clothes they wear." "I will," Kowalski said, his voice thick with emotion. He turned to leave, but Jason's voice stopped him. "What about Dawson?" "Suspended, pending termination," Kowalski replied without turning back. "He's not fit to wear the badge." He walked away without another word, a man carrying the full weight of his disgrace. After Kowalski left, a profound quiet settled over the house. The immediate threat had passed, replaced by the complex and messy aftermath of accountability. The anger that had fueled Jason through the night began to recede, leaving behind a deep, protective concern for his wife. He turned to Elena, his eyes searching hers. "Are you all right?" She managed a faint, weary smile. "I will be." She looked towards the living room, where the Tom Ford jacket lay draped over a chair, a silent testament to the night's chaos. "You didn't have to let him in." "Yes, I did," Jason said, taking her hand. "Sometimes the only way to end a fight is to let the other man surrender." Later that day, Elena walked into her home studio, a bright, airy space filled with sketches, fabrics, and mannequins. On a central table, laid out like evidence, was the ruined champagne-colored dress. The jagged tear was a scar, a memory of humiliation. For a moment, she simply stared at it. Her first instinct had been to burn it, to erase the memory completely. Jason came and stood in the doorway, watching her. He didn't offer to buy her 100 new dresses. He understood this was about more than just a piece of clothing. It was about reclaiming a piece of herself that had been violently assaulted. Elena picked up a pair of shears, her movements slow and deliberate. But instead of cutting away the damaged part, she began to work with it. She smoothed the torn edges, her designers, seeing not a flaw, but an opportunity. She spent the rest of the day in her studio, the sound of her sewing machine a quiet, steady rhythm of defiance. A week later, they attended a charity gala. The flashbulbs of the paparazzi erupted as Jason and Elena stepped out of their car. All eyes were on them. The whispers of the Rodeo Drive incident having already circulated through the gossip mills of Hollywood. But the whispers died as people saw what Elena was wearing. It was the dress. She had transformed it. The jagged tear was now the centerpiece of a new design. She had lined the gash with a fine, intricate lattice of gold thread, turning the scar into a brilliant, beautiful feature. The gold web seemed to hold the dress together, making it stronger and more unique than it had been before. It was no longer a symbol of violation. It was a testament to resilience. She walked the red carpet with a confidence that was breathtaking, her head held high. Jason was by her side, his presence a quiet statement of unwavering support. He wasn't just a protector. He was the witness to her strength. As they stood for the photographers, Elena felt a sense of profound peace. They had tried to break her, to diminish her, to tear her down. But they had failed. She had taken their ugliness and spun it into gold. They thought they could humiliate someone without consequences until he showed them what real strength looks like. But more importantly, she showed them that true power isn't about fighting back. It's about refusing to be broken. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. If you believe dignity is non-negotiable, like and subscribe for more stories that matter. Let's comment with respect and support each other.